Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in Art Criticism and Writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Shelley Rice is an art historian and critic. She's the author of Parisian Views from 1997 and Inverted Odysseys, Claude Kuhn, Maya Deren, and Cindy Sherman from 1999. She's also the co-author of many catalogs and books and has written numerous articles for Art in America, Art Journal, Ms. Magazine, and the New Republic, among other publications. She was a regular columnist for the Village Voice from 1976 to 77, the Soho Weekly News, 1978 to 79, and Artforum, 1980 to 82. She's an arts professor in the Department of Photography and Imaging and the Department of Art History at NYU, and she taught for many years here at SVA. 2 years ago, she was awarded the rank of Chevalier in France's Order of Arts and Letters for her contributions to furthering the arts in France and around the world. Do you get a sword or a horse or?
One of my colleagues gave me a kid's stick horse. So that.
For most of 2012, Shelley was the invited blogger for the online magazine of Paris's contemporary art museum, Jeu de Paume. If you pronounce it like I do, badly, like someone from Kansas, it sounds like the French for apple juice, and so that was what the blog was called. Tonight, as she says, from the vantage point of an aging hippie, she will discuss the similarities and differences, pros and cons, high points and low of her various forays into journalism. Please welcome Shelley Rice.
The first thing I want to do is to thank some of the people, Rob Perret especially, who worked really hard on this with me and whose support as a critic and friendship is a very big deal in my life and helped this a lot. I want to thank Levi and SVA for many years of literal support. Milagros, and what? Oh, there will be a few other people from the blog who will show up if they get through the Israeli mob. And the first thing I do want to say is how much I appreciate not only the invitation here, but also the people who worked on this blog, whether they were artists getting interviewed or whether they were critics who were working with me. Because one of the things about this is that it became a kind of community endeavor. And it was not something I did by myself, and it was always something that was done with other people, and that was the fun of it. So that being said, I'm going to show you about, 7 or 8 minutes of a not particularly exciting interview that was done with me during the run of the blog. It is embedded in the website of the Jeu de Paume, said correctly. And it's embedded in there just for general information so that the public could sort of see this. And the reason to show this as opposed to a lot of slides is that the design of the blog was really beautiful, is really beautiful. And there's a lot of multi-layering. There's a lot of the media. There are films embedded and Vimeo's embedded, and there's all kinds of levels of it. And what this does is give you a very good sense of how to navigate and negotiate around the blog. So I thought this was a much better way of introducing the issue. I mean, the blog is still there, so you just go to the Jeu de Paume's website, and the whole thing is still there. They're keeping an archive. The day I became an art critic was the day, I think I was around 20 years old, and I walked into the wrong room at university. I was supposed to be going to I do not know which class, and instead I walked into an art history class. I then met Lawrence Alloway, and the key to really everything that's happened in my life was the fact that this very famous British critic was my teacher and my mentor. And this is important not only because I looked at him and said, I want to like, which I then myself, but also because Lawrence was to really popularize pop art He was the person who was screaming that we should be dealing with visual networks of communication and not simply with museums. He was the person who was open to the networks of visual communication. And so everything that I learned and my entire training in my career, which consisted of classes with him and then I was his assistant in New York, was somebody whose mind was very open in an art world that was very polarized. Nobody showed photography in museums, and the photo community, which I tend to discuss a lot, at that point was not very many people. It was very few people who loved photo, who were very much together with each other because they loved photo, and no one else loved photo. No one else cared about photo. I got very interested in photography because it was the only place where you could find art and everything else. And I decided to make a career in this field, which really did not exist at the time, for the simple reason that it provided me with this really open field, which was not available to me if I studied or if I studied even, painting. And if I really wanted to work with all the levels of imagery in society, I needed to deal with photography. And I was not only in the photo field, but a lot of my friends were performance artists, or they were video artists, or they were installation artists. And this particular multimedia scene happened to be the friends I hung out with. So that again, that opened up the questions of photography enormously to me in a way that was really lucky for me. And I think that all of the work that I've done has been really focused on opening up ideas. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in photography. I'm interested in photography because photography is an image form. I'm interested in everything people create anywhere, at all times, ever, in whatever medium. And I chose photography because I think that, as Martha Gili would say, the image is at stake there. It is a place where you can explain that you believe that people create their world visually all the time.
Hello, my pretties.
It's not just my imagination, it's everybody's imagination. I have a huge curiosity, and that's what separates me from other photographers, because they're interested in looking at something, but they never discuss the nature of what they're looking at. So if I see a woman crying, I want to know, why is she crying? What's the nature of her grief?
I have to say that making this lecture was a real challenge. I love to talk, and there are two things I love. I love talking and I love writing, and so the blog was really fun. This lecture wasn't for a while because one of the things I realized is that usually when I'm doing something, I do research, and I do research on somebody else. That's the point of being an art critic. And in this case, I had no idea how to do research on myself. I actually was helped along a great deal by Holland Cotter and his beautiful lecture a few weeks ago because he shifted the conversation to a very personal level, and it seemed to me that personal level was really relevant. Now, I don't know how many of you, I know the students were all there. How many of you saw his lecture? Well, he talked about growing up in Boston and how his parents, when they needed to do something else, would drop him off at the museum as a child, and he would just go and hang out. And this, of course, made me laugh because, I was born here, but I grew up in sort of suburban Washington, and all we had were shopping malls, and no one in my family had even the vaguest interest in museums. So basically, when my mother and father wanted to do something and leave me out, my mother and father put me in front of a mirror in a store, and I sang and danced to myself for hours, and the sales girls would watch over me. So, of course, that's a real difference in personality and options. But one thing I must say, those of you who know me would not be surprised by that piece of information. But now, I think that this is it really rang a bell with me because it's the secret life of critics, because for the past, at least 2 or 3 decades. Whenever I'm freaked out or depressed or I just need something to clear my mind, I have a tendency to go up to the Met and I just wander around. I mean, like a zombie. I wander around. I sit in the Zen garden. I walk around the Egyptians. I spend a lot of time in Temple of Dender. And, you know, it's an incredibly, this is the secret life of critics. And I think I began doing this when I was a student at the Institute of Fine Arts, and I was the most depressed person in the world over that. And whenever it was just way too much for me to deal with, I walked across the street to the Met, and I went into the Monet Gallery, and I would stand in front of the terrace at Saint-Adresse, and I would just stand there, and I would go back to France. I would sit there, and I would look, and I would feel the wind, and I would feel the sun, and it was like having a vacation. It was my mini vacation. But essentially, I just left my body and I was there. It's sort of like, you know, Mary Poppins, you know, jumping, you know, in the film where she, you know, got the pictures on the sidewalk and she jumps through. I jumped through. And, you know, thinking about, you know, that, what I realized is that, again, I have, you know, some formal education, but the bottom line on it is that for me, art is a kind of metaphysical, emotional and mystical experience, and it is about a freedom from this time and this space and this mode of being. And it is the way, on some level, that I leave my body mediumistically and go elsewhere. Now, that is not just me being weird. That is actually very relevant. It's relevant to the story I'm telling, and this story will be about, on some levels, you know, there's a kind of dominant theme to it. You know, first of all, there's this idea of, you know, the intellectual versus the other aspects of art. I mean, often they work very nicely together. But the other thing that goes through this talk is that there's a constant push and pull between the journalistic element of my experience and the academic one. And the relationships between those two things and how, again, working on this talk, I had to sort of think about the way in which they enrich and constrain each other. Anyway, given my shopping mall background and a family full of accountants, you can be sure that becoming an art critic and art historian was not self-evident in my life. I had about 8 majors in college. I couldn't figure out what I was going to do. So when my students come in and complain they don't know what they're going to do, I laugh at them. And then one day I walked into the wrong room, and the wrong room contained Al Boehm, who has just recently died and who is one of the great art historians and who was the craziest teacher. He was writing these books on French academic art that had millions of footnotes, and it was just incredibly. And in class, he was a total nut. I mean, I walked into this room, and I think he had a German expressionist street scene, I don't remember which one, and a Michelangelo staircase. And he was pulling out his curly hair, freaking out about the way it pulled him and the way it was going to, you know, that he was just going to drown in it coming out of him. And I'm like, what is wrong with this man? So, I mean, I didn't even know which class I'd walked into, but I sat down, and I've never left. And this is really, again, this is important. And what I began to realize is that majoring in art history would solve all the problems that I'd had with the various majors. Because, you know, in literature, you have to spend an awful lot of time reading books. And it's a very theoretical process, really, because it's very disembodied in a way. And the one amazing thing about the film of arts history, you know, I don't mean of art history, I mean of arts history, is that it is a way, it's like all these pictures are on some level like aliases for human lives, for social lives, for enormous civilizations. And it is a way that this musée imaginaire in your mind, that you can see the entire set of aspirations of human beings in a kind of amazing sweeping parade. So that was settled. I mean, that helped me figure out what it is I wanted to study and what would give me the biggest range. And then I met the wonderful Lawrence Alloway. And Lawrence was a very brilliant critic. He was actually at SVA for a while, before he took a job, I think, at the Guggenheim, and then he ended up at Stony Brook, which was very lucky for me. And I took a lot of classes with this man, and the sort of salient factor about Lawrence is that he is where the generation begins of this conflict between creativity or metaphysical openness and academe, where my conflict sort of began and resolved itself as well, is that Lawrence had the perfect life. You know, it was just a wonderful life, but it was a life that involved a tremendous amount of, intellectual thought. And it also involved a lot of hanging out with people. That meant his students, and it also meant that his learning process was not limited to books and things like that, that he spent his time, with people, talking to people, interviewing artists, that it was a very experiential thing. Now, the other thing that's very important, though, is that he was ill when he was young, and he never really went past high school. I don't even know if he finished high school. Now, in today's climate, Lawrence would be just dead in the mud, but in fact, that was not, in the 60s. He was incredibly brilliant, and he learned a lot of things, and he had incredibly interesting ideas, and that got you somewhere in those days. But there was a constant push on him because while he had great pride in his lack of education, which led him to have an incredibly expansive and flexible and original mind. Nobody thought like him. The problem with that position was precisely the fact that he was just getting incredible amounts of crap from everyone. The sort of PhD-less wonder. So Lawrence took a tremendous amount of flack. And so, studying with him, I saw the two sides of this. But I decided I wanted his perfect life because I did want students, definitely, and I also did want to hang out, with other people. Now, Lawrence, the openness of Lawrence's mind meant that he was one of the people that was engaged, that was, seminal to pop art and pop art becoming accepted. He was British, and he was completely obsessed with media, with popular culture, with, signs and symbols and everything else. And he sort of constructed his idea of himself as a critic from the point of view of being essentially an anthropologist, that instead of his job being to guard culture and decide what's brilliant and what isn't, and exclude most people and just let a few through, that he basically liked working in what he called the expanded field. So that pop art, of course, brought in Brillo boxes and Campbell soup cans and various and other flags and paint brushes and whatever weirdness, and it opened up the subject matter. But at the same time, he was tremendously interested in movies, and he was tremendously interested in, basically the relationships between visual levels of culture. And again, his definition of what it meant to be a critic was very much about that essentially you're standing in the middle of this sort of radar field of information, all right? And again, most people come into this. You go into the IFA or you go into Harvard, and people tell you what to notice, how to notice it, and they do it in such a way that it gradually makes the field intelligible. It differentiates. Lawrence didn't believe in that, and neither do I, thanks to him. He believed in standing there in the middle of it and using your wits to describe the field around you, that your job as a critic was to be constantly, as he said, hounded by topicality, and to really work with this expanded field and could continually challenge yourself, not to exclude things, but to broaden them. Now, my students all know the main thing, and the first thing I learned from Lawrence was his concept of thought, of the mapping of thinking. And there was the triangle, and there was the line. And of course, there are several of my TAs who are sitting in here, and they're nodding, and it's like, yeah, we know about that one. That basically and again, this was Lawrence's thing, was that most people have a triangle in their head, and certainly academics do. And Michelangelo is brilliant because he's a white guy, and he did things for popes, right? And then, you have various other people. And of course, when I was growing up, women were not brilliant. I mean, Jansen had 0 women in it. Blacks were not brilliant. There weren't any of them either, So basically, you had this triangle, and the top of it was in the med, and everybody else was just sort of squished down. And that, again, the point was to educate your mind and culture and cultural institutions to exclude and to judge in a way that involved exclusion. On the other hand, the line, which was Lawrence's favorite thing, was that all these different aspects of visual culture, and he did essentially invent visual culture. And Nick Mirtzoff was on a panel I did about Lawrence, and he said, well, I have nothing to do with this. And then he realized when he was a student, in fact, he read Lawrence, and Lawrence had proposed a lot of these things. The field of visual culture was Lawrence's interest, and that all these different areas were basically separate but equal and constantly interpenetrating. Now, this idea, which will become relevant for my criticism, that basically at the same time as Lawrence and other critics were proposing this inclusion of popular imagery, of different modes of visual awareness, of, really including all kinds of things that had been excluded, you also had, gay rights and the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, et cetera. And essentially activism became a question of visibility. Who is visible? Okay, it's not only that women and people of color were not visible in the society. They weren't on TV either. They weren't in the movies, and they also weren't in the Met. That this question of visibility was a much bigger social and political question than simply an issue of, well, okay, I'm going to have the Guerrilla Girls in there. Anyway, so again, Lawrence's focus on this larger field in order to figure out how things evolved. I mean, one of his issues was, the idea of art as a series of just styles, a parade of styles, doesn't make any sense. And that, in fact, especially when you have things like the article was about Puerto Ricans. You have a lot of people who are trying to deal with social messages, and the style is not the point. That, again, opening things up. But anyway, even though all of this flexibility and all of these things were very much about the continual opening of a field, the problem is, Lawrence got so much flack about graduate school that he made, about not having any degrees, that he made me go to graduate school. Now, that was a collision course. I mean, me in graduate school was a collision course, especially, again, it would have been easier now, but in 1972, this was a nightmare. So I was Lawrence's assistant in New York while I was at the IFA. And essentially what you had was Alloway versus art history. Again, this was the war in my mind. This had nothing to do with an actual war. And this was also a time, at the same time as, again, you had very strict, rigid ideas of art history, you also had, at the Village Voice and in journalism, this idea of personal journalism. And basically, I decided that there was no way I was just going to spend my time in art history school all the time. So I began writing journalism for the Village Voice and meeting people like Ellen Willis and the people who were proponents of that. And then I went off to Princeton to study photography, and they almost threw me out of school because I was writing journalism. And the line was from the chair, how can you write subjective things when we teach you the truth here? Anyway. In other words, there was a clash of worldviews that was very formative to my development, and the line in my mind butted up against the triangle. Anyway, and so one of the ways I dealt with that experience, besides standing in the Met a lot and looking at that painting a lot, was that I started teaching at Brooklyn College. And I volunteered for a program called the Transitional Program, which was designed to get students into ready for college. They were disadvantaged students, and again, this was, the 70s. You still had really liberal stuff going on, and so the idea was that there were all these people who'd come from really crummy schools and never finished their education, and it was time to get them an education. And again, this also was really significant because my students, who were all black, they had 50 students and 49 of them were black, so all but one. And I would take them to the museums, and they were scared to go in. The museums, this was an incredibly loud, boisterous group of people, and they would go to the museums, and they would be like this. Again, it's hard to imagine, for those of you who are young, the splits in culture that were really happening at that time. And we'd be walking around the Picassos, and they'd be like this, and then all of a sudden we'd get to the photo section, and everyone would start to talk. It was like, oh, we know this, and then you could just have a big conversation. So I actually learned the history of photo. Nobody was teaching it at the IFA. It was simply not part of the triangle. I learned the history of photo because of my students as a way of communicating on different levels. And I think that again, Holland Cotter told the story of going to Africa. and confronting some of the artwork that he had had intellectual opinions about, and understanding the astonishing complexities. Okay, if something gets changed here, then it really screws up this group of people. That these incredible complications of the human mind, of human society, that all of these objects are embedded in. And in this case, that's what happened to me. That my students, because of my students and their fear of art and their understanding of photo and the ways in which these things worked out, I started understanding the real complexities of cultural image production and reception from a really totally different perspective. And that's when I went to Princeton, and that's when I decided to work on photo. The first thing that I did as a journalist was the Soho Weekly News. Well, I worked at The Voice, and then they wouldn't let me do the column I wanted to do, so I went to the Soho Weekly News. And the Soho Weekly News column, again, the structure of the time was this idea of opening up, images, okay? And what's interesting to me, again, having looked at this from the point of view of trying to do this talk, working as a critic, if you're working in the, sort of radar field mode of, being of a critic's first responsibility as describing their own time, that time really shifts and changes. And at the moment that I was writing, and I have some paragraphs from the blog that I can read to you. The moment that I started writing that, there was a certain set of conditions that, you had a lot of different kinds of photo. You had also a bunch of multimedia art. You had conceptual art. You had performance starting. You had video. None of this stuff was really in the art world yet. So that writing a photo column that would compare an ad with a photo in an art museum, or that would work with video, or that would work with the performative aspects of something. I mean, nobody was doing that. So the column became my way. And yes, the postmodernists who became postmodernists 3 or 4 years later, or two years later, they all read this column, okay? So this was part of a kind of zeitgeist, so that I would get phone calls when I stopped doing it and when postmodernism came in from some people like Richard Prince. Oh, you must like what we're doing because we were reading your column. So here's just, again, in the blog. This is the page, the intentions of the blog, and this will again come up later. In 1975, I started writing for newspapers in New York City. People read a lot in those days, and Soho itself, the lower Manhattan neighborhood whose warehouses and industrial spaces had been transformed into living and working lofts by industrious and often illegally squatting artists, was a hotbed of debate, discussion, and dissension about the role and meaning of contemporary art. Being a newspaper writer in that place and time was, simply put, a stroke of luck. Open and under-theorized, the photo field was just being discovered by the art world, and a large range of imagery fed several streams of artistic practice vying for attention on the streets of Manhattan. Art photographers, concerned photographers, photojournalists, and fashionistas shared the stage with conceptual, installation, and performance artists using the medium. Within this rich intellectual environment, articles, especially in newspapers, were like lightning rods. Every column published in the local newspapers was received interactively as a challenge inviting agreement, disagreement, adoration, or disgust. People on the street, in bars, in stores, restaurants, galleries, and museums felt free to offer opinions about our opinions. Community involvement, in other words, was the ground from which the extraordinary achievements of downtown artists grew, and it nourished art writing as well as art making. Writing for the Soho Weekly News, Writing for the Soho Weekly News in the 70s, my focus was on the local story, on the dynamism of the art scene unfolding in lofts on the streets, in galleries, museums, and alternative spaces throughout Manhattan and beyond. The work was pluralistic. The monolithic judgments and hierarchical distinctions between high art and low, avant-garde and kitsch, were unraveling in installation works, performances, and conceptual projects throughout the city. The aim of my Soho News column was to unravel these distinctions further, to explore the role of image making in the unfettered field of what is now called visual culture. Artworks and ads, film and fashion photographs, photojournalism, and installation works were mobilized by me. Each week I would juxtapose icons of our image culture, using them literally as signs that could tell me who we were. In An Anthropology of Images, Hans Belting wrote that, quote, "We are not the masters of our images, but rather in a sense at their mercy. They colonize our bodies, our brains, so that even if it seems we're in charge of generating them, and even though society attempts unceasingly to control them, It is, in fact, the images that are in control. Believing something like this on the cusp of postmodernism, I attempted to reunite art photography with its popular cousins, to animate images within the larger context of the visual field in order to analyze the myriad messages that colonized our bodies and our brains. So again, that was the Soho News column, and again, you had ads, you had male nudes. This is where the sort of Mapplethorpe folks, we had actually Robert Mapplethorpe, he had a really gross show, and I wrote a nasty article. And I'd been involved in the first male nude show, so one of the first times he showed, I was involved in that, so it had nothing to do with me having a problem with that. I was one of the people who had done that. But he decided, since I thought they were like fist-fucking pictures, you know, they were like intense, and I didn't see, there was too much information. I really didn't see the point. And he was so pissed off, he wrote a letter, to the editor saying that I was just like a Jewish girl from the burbs, and I was just too bourgeois to understand his stuff. So that this was too bad, but anyway, that was, that's how it goes, you put yourself out there, you take the flack you get, suck it up. Dara Birnbaum, Joel Peter Witkin, vernacular imagery like wedding photographs and violin ads in the New York Post. That was another thing I got a lot of flack, because there was this moment when the crack epidemic was beginning to hit New York, when the city was beginning to get really violent, and especially there was a huge backlash to the feminist movement, and there was huge violence against women, and I would write every week complaining about these things, and sometimes I wrote a manifesto and got people to sign it, and boy, did I get crap about that. Again, I was too much of a bourgeois Jewish princess to really understand the nature of contemporary creation. But anyway, now again, one of the things I want to emphasize, because it's so different from the blog here, is that our life was unremittingly local. And again, that's really hard for students here to really understand, because your lives are so different. And this doesn't mean that there weren't people like Frances Torres and Shirin Nishad and Dieter Froese. There were plenty of foreigners around. There was tons of them. But the stuff that happened, happened on the ground, And also, it was a really interesting moment. The city was a mess. A lot of white people had left. Soho was pretty much abandoned, so we could just colonize it. And so it was a particular moment when things happened in, Magoo's or the Spring Street Bar, and, Jackie Apple used to get up, she used to, the only time she ever went out was to go down to the Magoo's and talk to people. And people fought, and they argued, and they talked about art, and it was a very intense moment. But again, it was an intense moment that involved FaceTime, and that this is what I had wanted from Lawrence's life, was a learning process that did not involve the Bopst Library or the New York Public Library, but involved those things and this interaction with people who were drinking and making things up and changing the conceptual map of the world by hanging out at the Spring Street Bar. And it was a very nice time. Now, in the 1980s, Koch came in. The city started turning into the city that you know. And one of the things about one of the things on the blog that I talk about, I'm going to just read you this paragraph about the particular time of happenings, which was really before my time. An exhibition like the one currently at Pace Gallery on 25th Street, which was in March, a wonderful show of photographs by Robert McElroy, Fred McDara, Robert Frank, and others, artworks, videos, and audio tapes chronicling the early days of happenings in the 1960s, seems to describe a place more distant than Johannesburg. Young artists, as well as the rest of us, gaze in disbelief at black and white documents recording the antics of Alan Kaprow, Red Brooms, Carolee Schneemann, Claes Oldenburg, Simone Forti, and others, marveling at the energy, playfulness, spontaneity, and community that were hallmarks of a moment when life in the Big Apple was not so Darwinian. It is no coincidence that shows like this one and the Fluxus and the Essential Questions of Life exhibition at the Gray Art Gallery last fall are being mounted now in the city. Retro is the new local. Looking back, we inhabit a temporal utopia instead of a spatial one. Anyway, and what happened, and again, that's not to say these guys didn't fight with each other and drive each other crazy, but the fact is that at the point when this period ended and the rents started going up and people started leaving in droves because artists got thrown out of their lofts and thrown out of their apartments and they couldn't afford life here, and we all know this because you well are living it. At the point when that happened, I went into a deep funk because our FaceTime was completely broken. And so again, the differences between virtual communication, and of course we didn't have an internet then either. People moved to Europe. A lot of them moved to California. They're all in LA right now. And this is really a time when my sadness was so intense at this that I decided to do what I used to do at the Met. I just went back to Paris. And I decided I'd write a book about Paris in the 1850s. So in Paris in the 1850s, the city was redone. Artists were thrown out. Everybody was thrown out. Everybody was thrown out of their apartment. And the whole city was rebuilt to be the city it is today. And I decided they knew how to deal with this, so I would go and do research. And so I, basically just spent 12 years doing that. Because, the Metro pictures and the East Village scene and all that stuff, a lot of people were dying of AIDS. This wasn't my thing. So I spent 12 years, basically disappeared mentally doing time and space travel and spending a lot of time in France and walking on streets inhabited by Baudelaire, Zola, Balzac, and the Goncourts, so they could kind of help me cope with my life here. This is just to say that, in fact, art critics are just as weird as artists, that basically really good art criticism and art history is about human responses to their environment and people needing to explain things to themselves and to other people. So anyway, so I did that for a number of years. And, the other thing is, I am an academic and I am an art historian. And, there's a necessity to justify my intelligence in the usual ways. Parisian Views won all kinds of awards, but it still didn't persuade people I was a real historian because I'd written for newspapers. Me and Lawrence have the same problem. By the time Martha Gili, who's the director of the Jeu de Paume, asked me to write the blog, which again is an in-house name as Apple Juice, life in New York City in the 21st century had morphed again, and that was because of 9/11. And this is, of course, the city you're living in, and this is also the city that my blog, again, since I was functioning as, when I do journalism, I function as a medium, this mediumistic situation where the radar field is there, and then you just kind of have to look at it and describe it. You have globalization, you have the internet, nobody can get visas, it's incredibly hard for people to live here because the rents are insane. Stores are all closing, and I live in the West Village, like the pet stores are all gone, and now the supermarkets are going. Yet another Duane Reade. It's a very strange concept of human habitation. But anyway, the other thing, of course, is what Okwuegbunam calls the post-colonial constellation, the triangle of culture that was so unbelievably, unbearably strong when I was a young person. There were white guys, and then there were the rest of us, okay? The triangle was completely collapsing. And basically, no matter what art historians and hedge fund managers did, America had to take its place kicking and screaming with everyone else in the line. And this, of course, if you're actually functioning in the contemporary art world, this is a big issue for you. International art fair, travels, emails, all this other stuff. The fact, and this one of the things in my class right now we're talking about, is you have, art that travels around. Somebody like Song Dong can show his piece. He shows it in England, he shows it at MoMA, he shows it in Australia, and everywhere he shows it, it looks different. It's the same piece, but of course the issues involved in hoarding are different in New York than they are in China and than they are in, again, in Australia. So, all of these things start completely making complex all the issues. Now, once again, of course, the Academy, as usual, closed ranks. And as we've all noticed, the third generation of a particular ethos in training of art historians. We're now on the third generation, and it doesn't budge very much. The tyranny of limited theories and methodologies, and that became even more ossified in hiring, grant giving, and publication practices. So again, you're seeing this really big clash of worldviews, yet again, like the one that I inhabited in my 20s, of suddenly seeing an incredibly changing, expansive world, and it's basically everybody guarding the fort even tighter. The good fortune that I've had in my life, I think, since I love writing journalism, and I do it with enormous gusto, but I wouldn't want to do it all the time, is that I've been offered opportunities to do it at points when the world was changing. And it forced me into a position of kind of being the still point in a turning world and really putting on the sort of medium ears and trying to figure out, how it is that one lives in this world. I don't want to shut my eyes to what's going on elsewhere, and I don't want to live in the increasing disjuncture between the world of experience and art fairs and markets and the theories used to deflect what Oakwey and Weiser calls the intense proximity of our 21st century relationships with each other. I want to be in those. Anyway, the blog, like I said, Marta Gili offered me this opportunity at precisely the moment when it was time to explore these relationships, and the format is perfect. First of all, the one thing that's really significant is that the Jeu de Paume never, ever, ever told me what to do. And I know that one of the reasons Levi invited me is because he loved the fact that I just wrote long articles, and I slowed the process down, because if you were going to read it, you had to sit there and read it. That's just partly because nobody told me what to do, and I decided I was just going to do whatever I wanted. So I did not want to just say, oh, hi, today I went to the Chelsea market and bought this, and wow, here's a cool interview, but that person, that person's really got a nasty mother or whatever, The swarmy, bloggy, the tweety thing, that's just not my thing. I decided to take seriously this assignment in terms of describing my world to myself. And of course, the main thing, obviously, that's different, aside from the real complexity of this format, is that before there was FaceTime, the audience was local, the paper came out, it was published, there were editors, there were all these steps that had to, these gates, and it got published, and then it got thrown out, which is important. Now we're global virtual information. I mean, I finished this blog in October, and it's still there, and it'll stay archived there, and you can read it whenever you want. But also the blog was published in Paris, and I would send the photos and the text to Adrienne Chevreau, who was absolutely wonderful, and who was designing all of these things and showing all these pictures. Let me see if I can. This isn't particularly pretty. Again, the thing that was great from David Zwerner Gallery, Adela Abmesser, Peter Hugo from South Africa, Simon Johan, and Alessandra Sanguinetti. People were really incredibly gracious and generous. I mean, the blog is gorgeous because people just let me have whatever photo I wanted for free. So we took advantage of that and put lots of them in. Now, again, the other thing that totally differentiates this particular moment from the other really exploratory moment that when I did newspaper columns, aside from obviously the format change and the fact that it's published one place and I'm in another, there are certain shifts that are taking place that are kind of embodied in this format that were really of interest to me. One of them is this change in that parade of arts passing, this sweeping vista that I really loved about art history. But that one moved in a narrative, and it moved, you started with the Egyptians, or maybe the caves at Lascaux, and you just kept moving up in a very Judeo-Christian way, and it moved in one direction. It never moved backwards or circled in on itself or did anything like that. And our world and certainly the blog format is hypertext. This is a whole other thing. The narrative gets broken up, it gets rearranged, it gets reorganized. The other thing is that the newspaper is time-specific in a really different way. I would write something on Robert Mapplethorpe. Robert Mapplethorpe would, send the letter the next week. Everybody would read my thing. They would argue about it at the bar. They would get, either or get pissed off at what Robert Mapplethorpe was doing, and then they throw the newspaper away. And then the next one comes. And there was this sense of it being a particular moment that then just kind of disappears. The blog format is different. First of all, you'll notice we're reading it backward. It starts at the present, and it moves backward in time, which is also really interesting. But it's much more dynamic. It moves back and forth. It stays together. Okay, you don't read an article and then throw it out. The whole thing is there as almost an artwork. It gets built on itself. And it's like a newspaper article is a particle, and this is a wave. It's just a whole different thing. It develops in time. It stays together. There's cross-reference and revisions. And the other thing is that I was the editor and the writer, which is, again, having been for 40 years somebody who has editors, I love this. Yeah, there was one point actually when Marta Gili suggested that my blog posts were kind of long, and could I make them a little shorter, and the staff revolted. No, you leave them just the way they're. It's like, hey, okay. But that's kind of the only, and we all laughed, and that was the end of that. But the fact that I'm the editor and the writer of this situation also meant that there's a vision that was created of this series of writings. And the vision is there all the time, and it sets up an automatic idea of cross-references. And it's dynamic also in the sense that if I had a comment that I wanted to make about this show later, I simply went in, I could edit it. I went into WordPress and I added things and I subtracted them and whatever. So that whole thing, it's an overlapping situation where things are embedded in a much larger structure which stays together. Now, in terms of the content, one of the things about being a person who's obsessed with photography is that photography exists in a temporal bouillabaisse. It is obviously you take a photo, digital or analog, and it's like this moment when I'm looking at Milagros and I take this photo and there she is. And on the other hand, the fact is that photo then gets put in an album or put in a museum. Somebody will look at it in like 2115. They won't understand the hairdo. It gets moved around. It'll get put, with other people's photos. It'll get reorganized in terms of information. The fact that the photograph was taken, it still continues in a large-scale temporal movement that means that at any given time, today, if you wanted to, you could not only see things that were literally finished by artists yesterday or look at your Instagrams, but you can also go up and see the astonishing pictures that are at the Met in the American Civil War show, which is amazing, amazing. And so what photography does is allow the 1860s to just sort of inhabit 2013. This is the normal mode of photo. And the way the blog, moves things around and recontextualizes and reformats them, that bouillabaisse becomes kind of a normative mode of encounter. And it also allows you very significantly, again, since it stays together, to really focus on things like the different modernities. I mean, if I'm writing about Brazil, there's an article about a film in Brazil, and it's all about this sort of older modernity of the countryside in Brazil, okay? And that is very amazing because, again, and also there's South African things where you have contemporary issues in South Africa that involve urban political struggles of apartheid, and it's right next to an article about, the history of the Bantu tribes, which was done by a white guy from England, and it was published during the same exact time as all these urban people were screaming around about apartheid, okay? And you see, in a way that it's very hard to see in real life, the various temporal, various ways in which worlds cohabit a given space, totally different environments, totally different mental maps. They live next to each other. They live in the same space. And that the world, you can say a photo is objective and that it describes the world, but which world? Okay, this capacity of, again, this format to allow me to really play with. And this, of course, is an issue with, artists are exploring this kind of thing all the time. One of the things in the blog is, let's see. This is the apartheid show that was at ICP, and this is the Bantu tribes here. Dugan Cronin. This is a very amazing thing that is very much, like I said, the blog is invented for a time when somebody makes a piece like this. Santu Mofokeng, the Black Photo Album, Look at Me, 1890 to 1950. What he did was go around and talk to people. He realized that when he put up actual pictures of life in the townships, he's a black South African, people didn't like the photos. So he went around and asked them which photos they did like, and they had all these photos in their album from this very long sweep of time. And of course, they're not contemporary photo, but they are when he takes them, and he reprinted them. And he then made comments about the incredible complexity of a photo from 1890 where all these people are walking around in European dress and that this is the way they like to see themselves. But it was not a liberal, oh, this sucks, they're taking on the colonial gaze. It was much more about aspirations and the complexities of the ways in which these kind of image forms help define our relationships within culture. So that he took a photo from 1890 and made it into contemporary art by his very conceptual interest in it. So again, the blog is an ideal environment for working with something like this. Of course, the other thing is the shifts in space, which the blog represents, where you have, you know, the idea that there's a center, i.e. New York, which in my mind was absolutely the center of the world in the 1970s, and it wouldn't have mattered if it really wasn't. I mean, it was for us. You know, this idea doesn't make any sense anymore. Relationships are defined by blogs, and they're defined by the internet, and they're defined by the ways in which Song Dong's installation moves around all these different continents and looks different depending on people's attitudes toward hoarding, you know, and it becomes completely reformatted mentally by the context within which it works. You know, the exhibitions and the artworks move around on the blog. There's stuff from South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, China, Iraq, Lebanon, England, Germany, and France, and plenty of other things. And we're all moving around with the art. You know, there's plenty of traveling, you know, that goes on in here, including to Abu Dhabi, where I write about me moving around. And, you know, that spatial mobility really changes the nature of the encounter. And it also changes the nature of the reception. Now, there were actually lots of comments that came in, and they were sort of strange, so a lot of them I didn't put up. This was not a lot of, I was disappointed that there was not a lot of human interaction. People would like email me instead of putting comments lots of times. Now, Robert Stevens is here, and he did. He actually put up a comment. But on the other hand, the simple fact that you have art, writers, receivers, all looking at the stuff. You have a simultaneity of different perspectives and a kaleidoscope of perspectives that are just built into the situation, whether that be an international exhibition or whether that be the blog, because I got a ton of comments from people in Africa, and I got a ton of comments from people in other places. There were lots. Jennifer Bayorek and Erin Haney wrote a piece, and all their friends from Africa made comments on it. See if I can find it. The works travel around, and they change meaning in different contexts. They also engage different audiences who are busy recontextualizing, reinterpreting, and reevaluating their relevance and meanings and making comments. The interactive nature of this opens up the meaning of art and criticism simultaneously. And again, from my point of view, the most interesting thing is it makes it virtually impossible to maintain the fixed and traditional hierarchies that are centered in one culturally specific point of view. You know, when I was growing up, you had certain money interests that owned the New York Times. You had money interests that owned Art News. You had and that all decisions were made at these various levels, and this was a tremendous filter through which people saw things. It is absolutely impossible to keep up a one-pointed perspective on the world, the one that was so dominant when I was growing up. It's absolutely impossible if all these other things are on here. Now, again, from my point of view, that's what I wanted the blog to embody. I wanted it to map and interface with an enormously expanded world of images and content. And again, for myself, having read way too much third-generation language and a lot of blah, blah, where I realized that nobody was saying anything, I wanted to be in a forum with myself where I could really get back the language that I needed in order to articulate what this new situation is. Again, I love writing. It makes me incredibly happy, which is Levi, I'm sure, is rolling his eyes. We talk about this a lot. We've worked together a lot. But I feel like the tremendous pleasure of this particular situation was that it gave me the opportunity to try to engage and try to describe and try to work with in a very direct engagement with both the art and the audience what this is. And the personal register that I learned working in the Village Voice in the 1970s was really helpful because that personal register was precisely the grounding. And that's one of the things that's really problematic when you've got all this stuff floating around all the time. The personal register is the language I used on the blog as well. It was not only the link between my old and new journalism, but it was also the grounding, and my subjective responses became an anchor in this expanded field. That was like the one constant, was my subjective responses. And it anchored down this great holding pattern of the present that I, as a critic, was trying to describe. So anyway, I think that's probably all I wanted to say. You can ask me questions, but you know, I just want to say how grateful I was to have this opportunity at this particular moment to do this, and how much I feel like I got from it in terms of my understanding of the world and what I could offer to my students and stuff like that. Anyway, thank you. Questions?
Shelley, it's Robert. Do you think to be a critic today, I was just thinking about it, do you have to be something like a professor to make a living as a critic today, and then have this expansive space, which is amazing, like in the blog? And that's where you're, that's where, but in order to do that and to make an impact on people, your income might come from teaching today, right? As opposed to the Soho News or the Village Voice in the past. Okay.
Nah. I mean, I think, was it Marx and Engels who said they'd rather be a galley slave in Turkey than a writer in Manhattan? You know, I mean, that's just the conditions. With me, that's never really a big issue. I like to do my boxing matches with the university all the time, but it never occurred to me that I didn't want to teach, and it hasn't occurred to me ever. I just put up with this, you know. I mean, but teaching is part of this expanded field, because then you have young people who are, you know, they push me. If I don't know technology or if I don't know something, I mean, it's my students who are keeping me active. It's certainly not my own, you know, 1950s mentality, you know. So no, I don't find that a big conflict. And no one ever really paid me for writing. You can be sure of that. So I don't mind. I'm sure there are other people who do. I think that you know, again, the economics of things change. I think the big change that's happened here has nothing to do with writers who were always badly paid. But I've had a lot of photographer friends who made a fortune doing various things like fashion, and their income went down from $3 million a year to zero because of stock photos and things like that. I think right now we are experiencing technological changes that change completely the sort of economic structure of photographers. In the same way that everyone went belly up in the, say, you know, like the 1880s. You know, in the 1890s, the studios went belly up because of the sort of international corporate nature of photography. So I think that it's really not, you know, I don't find this as big a shock as I do watching my image-making friends and my students trying to figure out what to do. Somebody else? Irving.
What role does art theory play in your life, your career? Because you didn't mention it at all in your talk.
It actually plays an enormous one. This is a lot of theorizing that I just said, but I never said anything theoretical about it. I read a lot of art theory. Well, first of all, like I said, my aim is to communicate with humans. There was a period in the 1970s, I mean, you might have even been at this thing. There was a meeting of the Art Critics Association, maybe like late 70s, early 80s, when Gene Siegel was running it, and it was at SVA, and it was a discussion about what's the point of art criticism, and you had a lot of luminaries of the period in there, and only me and John Perrault thought that the role of the art critic was to communicate. And basically the answer from Robert Pincus Witten and friends was, oh, well, they just write for newspapers anyway. No, I read a ton of art theory, but I think that the language has gotten really rusty, and I feel like a lot of the theory is used to obfuscate and to keep you not only away from the experience of art, but also the experience of your life. So I read it, I take what I like, I reorganize the mental map in my mind. It's like glasses, you know, and you then look at the world, and you see if the world looks different because you read Boris Groys. And for me, it looks different after Boris. He's great. I like Boris. And so, but then I read a lot of other things, and the world just looks confusing and ridiculous. And, you know, I didn't get anything from this experience. And so I feel, you know, I spent 5 years teaching in the transitional program at Brooklyn College. And what I learned from that, and at the same time I was writing for newspapers, and what I learned from that is that if you can't say something simply, then you're talking BS. You know, that if there's something to say, it can be said directly and it can be communicated to other humans in a reasonable fashion. So, no, I wouldn't mention art theory a lot, especially talking about something like the blog. There's a lot of theoretical positions in this blog, but they're not ever hit in the head. Did that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, and the other thing is, like, since the point of doing this stuff is to refine the language that allows you to communicate complex ideas simply, you know, that theory is not gonna do it. Right, Ileana? Huh? Lights? Oh. Yeah, I know.
I have a
Yeah. I mean, that's the point. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the oh, can you not hear? I have a question regarding the split or the sort of two worldviews that you spoke about, competing worldviews you spoke about. One quite impassioned regarding the expanded field view of your education or your trajectory in criticism versus the art historical MFA or MA program you went into. And I was wondering if you could expand on that in relationship to your trip, specifically the sort of candid line about the East Village AIDS crisis, which you couched within this discussion about FaceTime relationship that was going on in the 70s, artists and that sort of thing, and the lack of that, or at least the falling apart of that, and the lack of that with the East Village 80s, which I find confusing because I've always sort of understood that to be such a very FaceTime oriented.
I think that, well, first of all, the city did start changing, and really a lot of people that were active in the 70s did leave, and of course a lot of them died. So there was there was definitely the scene going on. But the other thing, and it gets back to something that Holland Cotter was talking about last time, and that is that like artists who have a certain predilection for either sculptural materials or really love working in disembodied ways or like doing performance, critics also have propensities. You know, I don't do criticism like all the time, and there are times that I feel really attracted to, and they're usually times of a certain kind of reorganization of like the two I discussed. And there are other times where everything that's going on just makes it's like attraction repulsion. And Holland mentioned there was a certain point when he wasn't that interested, and he went and did other things, went back to graduate school and and so I went to France in my mind. You know, I went to the French 19th century. And part of it was that there was definitely a scene, but the scene, the postmodernist scene, et cetera, there was a real shift in the nature of subjectivity going on, which, again, like the shows, the very fine shows that have been going on about the 80s, one of the things that I feel never gets emphasized is that there was like an enormous rupture in the idea of subjective thinking and the idea of the self that, of course, you know, split with the postmodernists and lots of other things. And that I didn't feel very, you know, again, the postmodernists were very happy to talk to me because I'd been doing this column, and there was and there was a lot of interaction, and it was sort of assumed I'd become like a mouthpiece. But I have a very different sense to this day of subjectivity. And there was a lot that was going on with them that was revolutionary culturally, but that I really didn't feel very comfortable with. So this is totally personal, what I'm saying. So the people that I wanted to do FaceTime and the things that they were talking about when they were doing FaceTime, a lot of them were gone. And the things that were going on is something that I felt really estranged from. And again, one of the things I've been trying to say is that being an arts writer is it's exactly like being an artist, you know. There are things you like, there are things you don't. There are ways in which you operate totally neurotically and totally bizarre fantasy mode, et cetera, that it's not. I mean, academe is supposed to be very rational, but in actual fact, certainly my relationship to all this material isn't at all. It's really like being a writer of novels. Is that an answer? Mm-hmm.
I have a follow-up question. You mentioned the personal register of the writing on the blog and your criticism. Do you find that crossover in your writing for academia or your books, which I haven't read? Or what's the difference, I guess?
Yeah, sometimes. And you're not allowed to. You know what I mean? Things have rules. That's like if I decided I was going to wear a bathing suit to teach in. You know, I mean, you can't do that. The thing, I mean, I couldn't have written the book Parisian Views with the I register because I wasn't alive yet. But the other thing is, like, recently I had a piece in Art Journal, and it was a very serious piece. I've been writing a series of pieces about Lawrence Alloway because I want to publish a few more and then make a little book about him because I feel like he's way more important than people get. And so I did this piece in Art Journal, and it went out to a reviewer who, thank goodness, I don't know. The readers were, oh, my God. And basically one reader came back with, well, this thing starts with somebody talking about using the word I, so obviously this isn't serious, and I never even bothered to finish it. No, but again, it's like, okay. Anyway, the other one was equally silly. But the point is they published it. The I stayed in. But it's really hard to interject. Because, again, when I was at Princeton, and there was a rule at Princeton when I was there as a graduate student, and the rule was that graduate students were not allowed to write. They were not allowed to write out criticism or write anything outside. They wrote papers. And part of this, I think I won't speculate, but anyway, the point is we were not allowed to write. And I was writing at that point for Art in America, which is where I started, and then occasional pieces for like Soho News and Village, and then I got a column for the Village Voice, and I became an editor. But at the point when I was at Princeton, I was just doing Art in America and an occasional piece for Soho News. And this guy, the chair of the department, who said, we're supposed to throw you out of school, but we don't want to, so we're not gonna. But he did, he really wanted to know why I would write subjective things when they were teaching me the truth. There's like language games. It's Wittgensteinian language games, everybody has their rules about what you're supposed to be. And the idea was, again, what I see as an enormous strength of the personal register when writing journalistic things, which is, like I said, the way I see this job, right, is that I'm here and I'm going like this and the lightning is coming into me. It's like channeling. It's being a medium. And I'm trying to say what I see and what's significant and why and how it reacts. And I'm trying to have the blog embody this descriptive thing that's coming to me that way, okay? It's really kind of mystical, The personal register is necessary there. There is no outside truth that's legislating how one perceives a changing reality. And again, academic thought is almost the obverse. Academic thought, by definition, begins with a series of rules about how the world is structured and how you have to describe it. You learn that, you get A's, it's called formation. When I first got to graduate school, I was at the IFA. I had a Danforth Fellowship, and there were only 50 every year in all disciplines all over the United States. And there were 2 in art history. And what the thing that was really great is that during the time we were all in graduate school, they would get all of these amazing people together. Some of them still are friends of mine. And once a year, there'd be like a reunion of all of us, and we'd hang out with each other. And essentially, the decision was made to write a song about, how Danforth Fellows are just better trained in obedience than everyone else, because, of course, that was a very smart group of people, and we were all aware of the fact that what we did was just embody the rules well. So, again, one of the sort of things about, what I'm talking about here is becoming really aware of the very different natures of thought. And, I'm always getting in trouble all the time either way about it, but, I'm too old now to really bother. When I was young, and also I was young at a very sexist Mad Men moment, So it was really intense. At this point, people ignore me, so it's fine. No, in the art history department at NYU, when I ended up with, when I negotiated the deal with Martha Gili, the wonderful Martha Gili, to do the blog, I go into the faculty meeting, I'm all excited, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to do the blog for the Jeu de Paume. And there's a silence in the room, and nobody was upset at all. But Barry Flood, who's one of my closest friends and a absolutely brilliant academic, works on, medieval Islam, right? Barry looks at me and goes, what's a blog? So, yeah, it's a different universe.
Hi. I have a follow-up question on the idea that every institution is going to breed its own kind of conservatism because it's going to try to perpetuate itself.
Right.
And then you said something about visibility much earlier, about how this expanded visual field and this moment in the 60s when visibility becomes a political category.
Well, that's exactly what's happening now.
So
it's people from other parts of the world.
So I want to ask you something about that, because what you're describing is to stay attuned to people becoming visible, who of course could have been seen. They didn't not exist. So visibility is a very specific thing that you're describing. So I'm kind of interested what you mean by that, because of course people are there, but what you're saying is they're not seen in a particular way. And so how do you actually make that jump from you're seen, you exist, but you're not visible in a very real political sense, but also in an art historical sense, which is what is the field considered that's supposed to specialize in visibility, but takes it for granted. But what you're describing in the 60s, actually visibility it's not that these people they were visible, but not in a particular way.
When I was teaching at Brooklyn College, and like I said, I had all these students, almost all of them were older than me. I was like 22, right? And I had grown-up students. And this is, 1975, 6, something like that. And I had the class in the library. There was like 25 people. It was one of the 2 classes in the library. And because you had a lot of these older women, they also had children, and sometimes there were no babysitters, so sometimes there were children around. It was kind of like that. And at a certain point, Ruthie's child, who was 4, he was just farting around the library, looking through magazines and books, the whole, the magazine section of the library. And he starts screaming because he was a young black boy, and he came across Ebony and Essence, or Ebony or Essence, one of the 2 black magazines that existed. And he'd never seen a black person before. Again, there were 25 black students sitting in the room. But it's like being Dracula. You are simply not reflected in the mirror. You are just not there. And that scream by Ruthie's son, I can't tell you the meaning of that in my life, because, but that was the point. Again, I was a young Jewish woman. I'm still finding cousins now because everyone changed their name. The Goodsteins, because Erica Good at the Times is my cousin. Did I know that? No, because her father changed her name. I was going to graduate school and freaking out about being in Leonard Hutton's gallery. He was like God. He had the most amazing work. It ends up he was my relative. His name was Hutchnecker, and so was mine. He changed his name because you couldn't be a Jew and work, so you became invisible. And I think that the interesting thing, and again, watching Lawrence negotiate this, because he was very active in the women's movements and Puerto Rican artists and Art Workers Coalition, the fact is that at that particular moment, there were certain voices that were allowed to be heard, and it was not only in the university, but it was in magazines, it was in newspapers, and no one else made a sound. No one else was allowed to get through, including there were pictures of white wasps who were blonde. And that's who you saw. And sure, there were plenty of Italians visible. There were plenty of Arabs visible. There were plenty of Puerto Ricans visible on the street. Absolutely, you could see them. But they were never represented, because the images that represented you, these heroic images that represented you as the perfect American, was certainly not going to be a Jewish girl or a black girl. So the inclusion of the starting of Ebony and Essence magazine, and watching Lawrence grapple with, in a world defined by Greenberg's idea of style, okay, that moves along, it's totally style, and the entire history of art is stylistic construction. What that does is the world is completely nullified, And if you want to be a significant Puerto Rican or Mongolian artist, you just better learn the damn language game and do what everybody else is doing and be brilliant at it. But if you really want to talk about what it's like to be a Mongolian, no one's interested. So the visibility questions, and they still remain enormously complex. It's not like we've resolved them because now there's a lot of people around. But again, the luck I feel is that moment when Ruthie's kids screamed, I got something. I got it. I understood the complexities of this problem. And the Soho News column worked with it on these levels. And this blog, and of course the class I'm teaching now, works with it on other levels because now at this point, we're all the line, and you've got all this visibility, not only of people of different races and societies, but their artworks around, and their artwork gets published, and it's in museums in New York, and people talk about it, often badly. They often don't talk about it very well because they're trying to fit it into a certain type of discourse. So again, the question of visibility, okay, we see it, but do we? Okay, or are we transforming it into something that reflects us? I don't think these questions go away, but I've had the good fortune to be speaking of them at times that were very complicated, and at times when there was a lot to talk about in terms of the real, it's like the platelets under the earth that are beginning to shift, and to kind of be there at that point and try to figure out how to stand on the platelets is very exciting, I think.
Whoa, that's loud. As a follow-up to that question, I wanted to ask, in terms of this triangle that you were talking about and unearthing sort of art, and more specifically, you were talking about art by minorities, essentially. But in your experience, you were talking about unearthing the medium of photography in the 70s and 80s.
I didn't hear that.
Unearthing the medium of photography in your work. And I wanted to ask if you could speak more specifically about this idea of medium and what you think today what that would be in terms of unearthing or making a certain medium that's not, or that's invisible today, like photography.
The thing is that photography was invisible in the art world, but it's unbelievably, it's like Uli's question, it's like everywhere. So it was hidden in plain sight, like many other things. But what I was interested in, because since I had studied with Lawrence and I made a decision that I was never clicking off that expansive button. It wasn't going away, no matter how much I could have gotten 15 degrees, and that mind wasn't going to change. The thing about photography was it provided me with an opportunity to talk about all the things we're talking about today. It was not about me telling you what Picasso did between 1910 and 1911 and how the lines changed. It was about I could use the entire expanded field. I could go to the Met. I could have a job at NYU. I could also deal with, street signs or pictures in a newspaper or your photo ID or, internet pictures and postcards. I mean, I'm right now doing a project on 1900 and the levels of imagery in 1900. And, when you take that stance, even as a historian, again, getting back to the question about historian versus critic, I do the same thing. Sometimes the people are dead and sometimes the people are alive. But what I was trying to do is, instead of funneling my mind into seeing just one thing, like Stieglitz in 1900, the fact is that even though the history of art has been written in such a way that Stieglitz is the main protagonist, and he is very hip, no question, but the fact is that this was exactly at this moment when studios were going belly up, when international capital was taking over in terms of corporatizing the medium, and where postcards came in and huge tourist industries. So all this mobility we're talking about, that was another really intense moment of that. So photography allows me to play with that. It allows me not to just talk about, Gregory Crewdson, but I can tell Uli the story about the scream in the library when that little black kid saw this magazine. It just opened up. What it was, again, it's like, as I said in the interview, it's not like I care about photography. It's not like I'm totally obsessed with photo. I am obsessed with making the field as broad as possible, and photo is that field. And so I think it's still that field, frankly. I think if I was going to say choosing a medium again, this would be it. It's just changing. And it's opened up more. It is possible, you know, even if you're interested in Korean art, or you want to look at Meshagaba, or you want to do anything, and you don't have the money to go to art fairs, what do? You look at reproductions. You can go to somebody's website. So that, in fact, I made a good choice for what I want, okay?
So I was wondering, actually, since you had such a positive experience with this blog, did you feel after the project was over that you had a specific drive to kind of continue that blog work, or to create a blog about other projects that you're doing now? Or would you consider it?
No, probably not, because I was tired. My ideal, and that's another thing, the question about academia and journalism. I love writing journalism, but my ideal way to do it would be to do it for a year and then take a few years off and think about it and then do it for a year again. I would never have functioned very well as Jean Perrault or any of those people, the Hilton Kramers and the people, or even Holland Cotter. I couldn't do that. I like to think. You know, I do really concentrated work, writing all the time for a while, and then step back and talk to dead people and do something else. No. No, it's not like the blog was the point. But on the other hand, I liked it so much that after I've rested and thought, if another opportunity came up at a moment as interesting as this one, I would do it in a second. Yeah, it was really fun. And also, it's great. You get to say whatever you want, and people have to read it, you know. I mean, it's just, you know, excellent. Anybody else? Well, thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy your spring.